wisely tonight. I started off your sheets, and I'll start off by just saying this is one of those topics that I care about a lot, and I've kind of had my eyes open to a lot, but I can't say I have all the answers for either. And I kind of feel it's hard to talk about something when you don't feel like you have your full mind wrapped around it. But I'm going to bring out the issues so you can think about them too, so you can have your mind messed up a little bit like mine is. That's the goal here. What does your money do when you give to missions? And you don't have to answer these, but if you have an answer, just kind of think about these. How much do you get for a full-time missionary in the field? How much do you think a full-time missionary in the field cost? How much support we give them, and then maybe extra support the missions agency has to give for training or whatever. And then if you want to count extra stuff, there's missionaries that the whole job is to help support other missionaries to get to the field. You have aviation people, you have medical, you have teachers that are teaching their kids in school sometimes, and a lot of support staff. I'm not even talking about the support staff, just talking about to send a missionary to do work, whether they're a support missionary or whether they're more of a frontline kind of evangelism and church planting kind of missionary. What do you think it costs? Depends on family size, depends on where they are. You know, missionaries aren't often fully supported a lot of times, but it wouldn't be hard to estimate. You're looking at 80 to 100K. They have extra expenses, and might have cheaper living wherever they are, but they have extra expenses because they need flying back and forth, furloughs, stuff like that. They might have extra expenses. You have benefits if they're going to have any kind of retirement when they're done, or their kids' schoolings might not be able to be right there where they are. Obviously, everyone is different in their things, but there's a significant amount of money per year, right? And one of the questions is, how much do you get for that? How much benefit do you get in missions for this? What is the goal of our giving? When we give to missions, what are we trying to accomplish? I'll put that question actually to be answered if you have a thought on that. What do we want to accomplish when we give to missions? The Great Commission. I've gone back to that a few times, right? Make disciples of all nations. Okay? That's the goal. And there's different aspects of that. Different missionaries have different parts to play in it. Sometimes it's very hard ground. They're just trying to break the soil up so the gospel might be able to be planted there. Other times they're more upfront evangelism. Maybe it's their church planting. Maybe they're training leaders in the church so the church might grow and develop in depth. Maybe they're doing work to help with the poor and with physical needs. Sometimes with the purpose of sharing the gospel. Sometimes combined with sharing the gospel. Sometimes not as much. But the goal of giving is disciples, right? And I would say it's more, it's not just disciples, but disciples that make disciples is ideal, right? If we can develop people that will share Christ and lead other people to the Lord, that's even better. So often missions, the aim shouldn't be just to share Christ and lead people to Christ, but should be to plant churches, because churches are ones that help disciples grow. They help evangelize their own area, meet the needs of the poor in their area, but they also then can help maybe later sending out missionaries or spreading out the gospel from there. So churches are the kind of centerpiece of what God does. So I'll put churches kind of over here. Just kind of making notes here. Any other thoughts about that? What's the goal of our giving? We did talk about meeting physical needs is something that we don't discount and we don't think that has no value. But it's not our full ultimate goal. It's just to meet physical needs. It can be a good way to get in, and some places you cannot get in. Like my brother shared about the only way he could get into where he was to work meeting physical needs. It was the only way he could get in to share about Jesus. And also to build bridges so that people would be opportunity to listen. Okay? Do our gifts always help, or do they hurt sometimes where they're given? It's a question we don't ask very much. And there's a certain level, I don't think that every Christian needs to worry about this overly. But this is the question that missions agencies should be asking. Are we actually helping where we're going, or are we creating problems where we're going? Christians can sometimes have good intentions, but sometimes can do damage in what they do. And I'll give you some examples here. Where our gifts, our support of missions, whether a missions family or whether a missions organization, our work, is it being effective? Are we really accomplishing what we want to accomplish? Missionary letters are usually going to give us the good. All right? If they don't, they tend not to get supported. But if you went to their communities, if you went to the people that they're saying that they're reaching and serving, how essential would they say that they are? How essential the ministry is. Let me give you a little example in our own place. There's no Southern Baptist churches in Huron, correct? Okay. But there are a lot of good churches. What if the Southern Baptists said, hey, there's no Southern Baptist churches in Huron? And so they go around to other Southern Baptist churches, and I'm picking on Southern Baptists, I'm just picking a large denomination. They go around to other Southern Baptist churches and say, we need to plant a church in Huron. And so they raise a bunch of money. They raise $500,000 because that's the kind of money you need to be able to pay for full-time pastor for a few years, to buy a building, and to get the ministries up and going from maybe that place. And all this money, and actually Southern Baptists like doing part-time guys, so they'll send out like a couple, a team of 2-3 couples to maybe go out and go plant that church. To go plant it in Huron. Then they send out missionary letters. Oh, we have this need now and this need that we found. And so these churches are pouring in money to plant a church in Huron. Would you say that was the most effective thing to do? Would you be able to find a good church if you lived in Huron? Hey, we're not that far away, right? Some of you guys live or are close to Huron, and we have people in our church that live in Huron. But there are other good churches in Huron, in town, right? So that would not be very effective, but you wouldn't know that unless you live in Huron. But there are other places in South Dakota, there are no good churches in a town or in an area. Or maybe you have to drive pretty far to get to a good church, or there's only one good church in the town. And obviously that you have to define what is a good church. Is a good church have to be a certain one denomination? Or a couple denominations? How much is a good church? And those things you have to define, Are you going to work with these other people of different denominations? This is the same issue they have on the mission field, right? They go, this place, this country, they have these needs, and And then they have to say, well, how many churches, how much work is being done here? Well, do you count other denominations' work? Do you count the people who live there and their own churches that they have that's started by their own people within that nation, indigenous churches? Do they count? So you get some tough challenges here. I'm throwing out all the problems. I will have hopefully some solutions, and you can help with some of these things to think through. I hope it's not too discouraging of a night, but I hope you'll be a little bit discouraged, as at least enough to get you thinking, like get you chewing on this. All right, I think this is one of the most important books ever written on missions. You see it got chewed up by, I don't know, one of the moves or something. Anyway, it got chewed up from something, but it is still on my bookshelf. In fact, I probably need to get another copy or two. If you'd like to read this, you're definitely welcome to borrow this. I probably should get another one or two because it really is something I pass out often. This book it'll change the way you look at missions. I'm going to read a couple pages from it because I'm really basing this whole message on this book. I am basing it a little bit on these books. They're both by the same guy, but Revolution and World Missions. It's K.P. Yohanan. He's the director of and founder of Gospel for Asia. And then this is another book by him, Come Let's Reach the World. Talking about indigenous, supporting indigenous Christian leaders instead of always sending our $80,000 to $100,000 American missionaries that need lots of training and lots of years of support to get over there, and instead maybe paying someone that you're paying $2 or $3 a day to do missions. Anyway, this book starts out, Mexico, 2007. A Mexican orphanage near the U.S. border had figured out how to work the system. American Christians are generous, very generous. But when it comes to the ways they give, they can be a bit uninformed, and this orphanage found it easy to keep them this way. During the Christmas season, truckloads of gifts arrived for the parentless children. Many U.S. churches had heard the call of scriptures to help the orphans in their distress, and they responded in the way they've been trained to respond. Give money, send gifts. Church after church sent truckload after truckload of nice stuff. As one truck was emptied, the goods were quickly hidden so the next church with their truckload of stuff wouldn't see the vast amount of gifts already received from other generous churches. All the churches were easily kept under the delusion that they were giving the only gifts these poor children would receive, and the orphan children were known by the locals to be the wealthy kids in their neighborhood. My friend Walter, who was working for the spiritual well-being of these kids, was amazed at the high quality and vast quantity of gifts being received. He watched as a truckload of very nice football jerseys was unloaded, and be soccer jerseys, I believe. They all matched with a different number on each jersey. The young men were delighted. The photos taken with the church folk who gave back in the U.S. showed joyous, beaming smiles. But this delight on their faces was not for the reasons we might simply choose to believe. These young recipients of the gifts knew these jerseys would receive top price in the markets. They already had way too many clothes. Americans love to give clothing. Hours later, Walter saw these same jerseys in the markets for sale. Cash now in hand, the boys came back to the orphanage. That night, Walter noticed that these same young men leaving the orphan complex. Curious, he followed and watched as they walked out to meet a truck arriving from the city, arriving with a different kind of Christmas gift. Several young prostitutes. Now, that's one story, I understand. But there's a lot of stories like this. We have a lot of money in our nation. We do a lot of work, great work. I think God will bless those people that gave. But if we can give wiser to better places, we should. Lauren has some stories you've either seen or heard. I have stories that I've heard and and come across. And missionaries, if you ask them, they'll give you stories too. I was talking with Boniface. He had some stories that he saw with his own eyes about corruption and people taking advantage of the generosity of usually the American church. It's no doubt that the American church is generous, but we also need to be wise. And that's why the title is Giving Wisely, is because there is a need for us to think about where we're giving and be careful of what we're giving if we're given the opportunity to do that. Any thoughts about that? Let me go through this sheet here. I have some of these issues, that the giving issues, that how they can be negative and create potential problems. I'm not saying this as in that you need to hold back your money and be stingy and go, well, there's no chance that it's going to be beneficial, or it's probably going to be abused in some way, so I'm not going to do anything. But I want you to know what these are so that your antennas will be up. When you listen to missionaries, when you get those letters or those emails that say, please give to this or that, you know how effective those things are. There are missions agents, or there are, organizations that are for helping the needy and the poor in other countries. Some of those agencies have percentages as low as 5 or even lower percent of money that actually goes to those people in need. The rest of it goes to the administration, the advertising, and all the other stuff that's built around it, and very little of the money actually goes to the people. There are ways to give to really have your money and your effort having impact, and we'll get into that. Here are some of the other issues that can happen. I think they call this in Papua New Guinea, but other places, rice Christians. No, that's other places. Okay, that's Papua New Guinea's definition of it, but that's a very specific to that place, I think. This idea of rice Christians is an idea that Christians have money, okay? Christian missionaries have money. And we might not consider them having a lot of money compared to us, which a lot of missionaries do not. They're not that well off compared to the average American. But they go to places where the average income is $2 a day. Some places, $1 a day. This is what working people get. That is absurdly low in our mindset. You know, we would never work for that for an hour, let alone a day. And they don't work an hour or two a day. They work 12 hours a day and sometimes 16 hours a day to earn that $2 to provide for their family. And they do as much as they can elsewise to provide for themselves. But when a Christian comes along, or a missionary or a missions agency or something else is coming along trying to do some work, and then they hire local Christians to help do their ministry they want. And they go, this is great. There's people here that are work for cheap, but we can hire them to do the ministry. We can have them run the school, the hospital, the whatever. But we only want to choose Christians because, you know, if you're going to run a Christian school, who would you hire, right? You're going to hire Christians. So then you have these people in there. They go, well, it's $2 a day to work myself back-breaking labor to do this difficult job of, maybe work in construction, but it's, they don't have the tools that we have often and stuff. Or I can go work at the Christian school and they pay $10 a day. But all I need to do is say that I'm a Christian, get baptized, and go to church. And if you're barely providing for your family, what do? So you have these people they'll become Christian because it means providing for their family. You have the same thing for Muslims as well. Muslims are pumping money in from the Middle East, and that's what's happening in Africa, is that they're buying off people to convert to Islam. That's happening in Nigeria, and it was really a kind of a slanted line across Africa that the Muslims are trying to push, and they're sending this Middle East money down there. They're doing it by violence, but they're also doing it by, hey, we'll give you a free education for your kid. And they don't have public schools especially for older ages. We'll send them to a nice school and get them a good Muslim training. These parents are barely being able to feed their kids. And they go, well, they're going to get a good education, have an opportunity at life. So they become Muslim for that. Same things happen with Christians. So rice Christians are ones that are becoming Christians so they get fed. They're starving and they're going to get food by this. There's also a wealth gap. If we help support someone that's doing ministry work, or we help just hiring them for something like that, at times, or we help out somebody. The example was given that you have some evangelists that are going around and trying to share the gospel, and they had no mode of transportation except walking. And so one of the stories was of a church that decided to provide a couple bicycles to the young men. Young evangelists, so they could go out and do that. But it created controversy within the church that they were in, because the old men were also being evangelists too. And in their culture, the old men would have first dibs on those things, not the young men who could get around better. The older men that couldn't get around as well and were top of the society weren't given that, and it created a controversy within their place. You got to realize that even small gifts can sometimes be a huge deal, really throw off the balance of things. Giving $20, if that's 10 days' wages for an adult man, that's a lot of money. That really does change things. And if you go to a third world country, you'll see some of this stuff. You know, I did a mission trip in Mexico, and you see some of the shopkeepers, they see white American, they go, oh, price up, We were getting Coca-Cola. Now, this is a long time ago. I'm old now, 25 years ago. But Coca-Colas, we're getting for 25 cents. And it was 50 cents, but if you return the bottle, you got a quarterback, so it was 25 cents for. We're like, great, this is awesome, Gold ones. And then we realized the locals got them for like 8 cents. We're the rich Americans. Now, okay about that, but there are times when that wealth gap just really creates controversies and problems. And especially if someone's supported, a local is supported by overseas. We might not think it's a lot of money, but it really is to them, or some gifts that might be given. The next one is the white burden. Does anyone know what this is? This is not white guilt. Okay, this is different. White guilt's in our own political system issues. The white burden. Okay, the white burden in mission circles is kind of known as, we see how much we have in the U.S. or the West, maybe Europe or somewhere else, and a mission, we'll go over to a place that's very poor, third world place, and we'll see what they don't have. They might not have fresh water, they don't have refrigeration, they don't have really what we would consider very basic things. A second change of clothes or something like that. And so we feel guilt that we have all that we do in our place. So when we're given that situation, that we go to try to help solve their problems. Well, let me help you find a way to get fresh water and help you find a way to, and sometimes that is the need that they have because they have people dying because of that. But the white burden goes more and more of like, well, we have a lot of abilities for technology and information and different things, and they don't have all these things. Maybe they don't have the farming practices to understand of all the things that we understand here. Well, you guys understand here, and in farming and stuff like that. So, like, if only they could understand what we do. So we end up, missionaries can get in that trap of ending up spending so much of their effort and time into just giving them American information and culture. And then that gives a separation between them and the people, that it's like, well, I have all the information, you need all of it. And you're trying to convert them into becoming little United States, little Western place. When what they really needed, they were doing okay. They were surviving. They were living their lives. They didn't know what they were missing in some respects, or they at least were content the way they were. And now we're creating these issues, but we're not giving them the gospel. Another issue is cultural differences. Sometimes we want, extreme version would be, kind of going over to some place and teaching them the hymns, or teaching them certain American ways of worshiping and things like that that might not fit with their culture and their people. Things that might seem very important to us, or other parts of our culture, like you go places in Africa or other places that they might dress like Westerners during their preaching, because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to have a suit and tie when you preach. But that's not fitting with their culture at all. That's not how they dress. Are we creating these are we teaching culture to people in Africa and Asia and South America, or are we trying to teach them the gospel? Next one's cultural snobbery. This is connected with it, but just thinking my culture is better than yours, so I'm going to fix your problems and tell you all the things you're doing wrong. It's a really dangerous thing. We don't understand why they do things sometimes. But to come in from an outside way and realize that they might have good reasons for it, and in fact, they probably have some stuff in their culture that's better than the stuff in our culture. Materialism is a big deal, a big problem in our culture, and other nations look at us and go, why do you think you need all that stuff? Why is it stressing you out? You guys are rich. You have all the food you need. You have all the clothing and provisions you need, and you're all stressed out about not getting this or this. You love money more than you love God. That's the view that a lot of people have in other nations about us. Then about theological focuses. So our culture has certain things that we're focused on. If you go to a place in Africa, they're not going to have the same questions that we have here. So we might be interested in when does the rapture happen in the tribulation, and they might be wondering how you handle persecution. I'll tell you pretty straight, Americans aren't going to have a good answer for how you handle persecution very well, because we haven't experienced it, not the way that most other places have. So there are places that issues that come up, like what happens if a man has multiple wives and he comes to Christ? Now what should he do? Well, they say the leadership in the church can't have multiple wives. Can't serve the Lord with multiple wives. You got to get rid of one. So then you're convincing a guy to dump a wife on the side of the street, kicking her out of his home, wife he has children with, and not to provide for her anymore in a country that's destitute and poor. This issue has happened a lot. There's tough questions to answer. We can't just give our simple answers we have in America because we haven't wrestled with those issues. So understanding that they will have to wrestle through those issues by digging into scriptures themselves, and we can point them to places in the scriptures and ways to kind of think through that, but they ultimately have to make some of those decisions as believers. Once they become believers and are following the Lord, they need to answer those questions for themselves instead of having us answer all that for them without having much understanding. All right, so that's a lot of problems. Any thoughts about those things? And we, go. No, go.
We saw that too in Nicaragua, both that example and then also just the creation of mini Americas kind of in different villages where you'd go into churches that had been established for years and years, but it really looked like a mini church from here, and you could tell it went against their culture. It was just, it felt awkward because you knew it wasn't genuine almost. Like,
Yeah.
I think their faith was genuine, but yeah, it was definitely a hindrance.
Yeah, bringing an American-looking church and style of church in the middle of a different culture doesn't always fit. I mean, one of the stories in the book was about a church that comes in the slums. They had slums or trash heap area or whatever, and they had this church that was growing, like 200 people, and they came in and said, well, the American church sent a mission team down and says, we need to build them a church so they could worship. And so they built them down the church down there, and now, years later, there's like almost nobody in the church. Well, it disconnected them from the community, from the people they were living among. They're building a church that's nicer than their houses and separated. It looks like the white man's place, but it's not our people's place. You're not connecting with that place. I mean, even in this community, if you had some New York City guy, LA guy come in here and say you got to do everything the way a big city church in New York City did or LA did it, you might have some problems with that, right? Because it's a different culture over there. And it would actually probably hinder other people if you tried running a church just like you would in Hollywood or the Beverly Hills. You try to run a church like that here, it's not going to go off very well. People are going to see it disconnected from the community. And if you try to pull that off in West River, even more so would that stick out as not fitting, because it's even farther of a gap. Good. Any other comments about those things? I want to get to some solutions, some help here. Yeah.
I'm not just randomly giving money. I know these people.
Yeah, personally knowing who you're giving to and trusting them. Well, that leads us exactly into one of the solutions he's going to give us here. So, from this book here, I just figured he's going to have better solutions than I do, so I just went off of his. He does it. Raise. It is 4 solutions, 1, 2, 3, 4. But it works better because it's actually a word as opposed to like CHSH or CDYC or something like that. But anyway, raise. First one being relationships first. Building connections of relationships to know that you can trust who you're giving to know that you're not trying to just solve the problem. So there's 2 sides of it. Knowing where you're giving it to. So I went to a pastor's conference. It was a rural ministry, small town pastor's conference. And a guy from Africa came. He had no connections with anyone there. He was looking for a pastor's conference, and he went around soliciting, trying to build relationships with guys to get support for his ministry back in Africa. Why did he come over? Because the money is here, and all he needs is a couple churches to support him, and it was well worth the plane ticket and the money that they expensed to do it, and they could really expand their ministry. Problem was, he didn't know if this guy was a, swindler or a faithful minister of God. I didn't know. And the other guys didn't either, and it wasn't an appropriate place and way to handle that. But when we know someone like Boniface, we get to know him, get to know the ministry he's doing, and build some stuff there, that's a little bit different story now. That's an African too, but you can get to know what he's doing, and he has accountability, he has organizations that he's connected with and supporting. So there's a much higher level of trust you can have in giving to that. I know exactly what it would be used for. But the relationships on one side is to know that you can trust where you're going to give. But then secondly, connect with them and their ministry before the money comes. Not just so you can trust, but so that the money is not your solution to the ministry. Missionaries need us. They need our prayers, they need our cards, our emails, our connections, they need our love, they need our energy and support. And missionaries overseas that are already in position need to be reminded and encouraged and helped. They need us to love them. They need us to be involved and understand what's going on in their ministry to be able to help. Sometimes money is not the thing they need the most. Sometimes it's something else they need. Plenty of missionaries don't last very long. Last a couple years overseas or less. You know, Myron's sister just found out about someone that lasted a couple months, 2 months, 3-4 months, just left, walked out, leaving a giant hole in their position. You know what? That's not that uncommon. So they need more than just money. They need these relationships, and so that's what he talks about, and the importance of building those relationships. And then the second one is accountability. If we're going to give money, we need accountability to where that money is going to go and how this money is going to be used. Is it really helping? And generally, some typical things is missions agencies can help provide accountability if the mission agency is an accountable type place. Some mission agencies are very good with providing accountability. Some are not. So digging into those mission agencies, which ones are good and which ones aren't. And those are things you kind of have to ask around about and you have to dig into. Missionaries will tell you, the word gets around. But not being a missionary, many times you just don't know which ones are the best, you know. But accountability there, also just to follow up about what they're doing with their gifts, with missionaries, with their work. You know, are they doing what we want them, what they're called to do? You know, what the mission agency has for them to do. Some mission agencies are checking on their missionaries where they're supporting them and helping them. Some just are the accounting to help get them overseas. And then everywhere in between, you know. So is there accountability there? What is going on? How do we know if we give money or give help, is it really going to be what they need? And this takes a lot of questions. It takes some really digging into. Obviously, the more you trust somebody, the more you're able to do that. Often a typical thing is if they were already doing that work, especially indigenous workers within that country, if they were already doing it for free, they're usually pretty trustworthy. If they won't do it unless you send them a lot of money, then you can really be skeptical about it. You know, I don't think anyone should be a pastor unless they're already serving in the church. I don't think anyone should be a missionary unless they're already serving ahead of time, right? Don't send out a missionary and just sit in the pews not doing anything, and then they're suddenly going to go off and be a missionary somewhere else. And Steve was talking about that when he was here. Any comments or questions about those two?
There's some missionaries that don't have, I'm thinking, I don't want to say names. There's certain missionaries that don't have a board, and you just wonder how the money's being spent.
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, how much accountability is needed to be able to give to a certain ministry or thing? I mean, obviously, if it's really small, you got to scale it, a little bit how big of a deal. It's interesting. You bring this guy up here, KP Yohanan, he had a scandal that happened. Anyone hear about that? He was on the board, and I think his wife was as well, on the board that handled all the money. And the way they dealt with it, well, they started out as a tiny little thing. He's from India, Indian man, and he's helping to support these local itinerant, just like evangelists and pastors are going out and planting churches by the thousands in India. I mean, they're doing tremendous work, and he's like, if you give them $2 a day, they're able to live on that and able to evangelize India. So he's collecting money, and he's handing it out to these guys. But how do you know it's getting there? There's no trail of it. It's just getting into him, and then he's sending out. Now, that might work if you're sending him $500. But when he starts bringing in millions of dollars, there's a lot of questions. Is this money actually getting to where it is? And there's no proof of it. And if they see a need, they're just meeting it because they have money. But do you know if that's really the right thing? And that scandal kind of hit because there wasn't that accountability. People kind of found out that there was really no trail where this money was going. Now, they dug into it. They finally got some outside help and really dug into it. And they found out it looks like they've been faithful with the money, As much as we can see, they've been faithful with it. He's living a very simple, poor life. He's not living it up and taking advantage of things. But you wouldn't know what he might be doing. So they had to bring in extra accountability to the organization, Gospel for Asia. But they lost a lot of giving and had to return some money for anyone. They said, we'll return any money anyone gave that has any questions about us and stuff like that. And I think they lost a lot of support by that because they didn't have that accountability. So, I think there is a level that should be accountable. All of us, You guys have accountability here. The board and elders meet together and talk to me every year about, how I'm doing, what I need to work on, and things like that. That's appropriate. So, I guess you got to use God's wisdom about what level of accountability each, is needed on things like that. Good questions. Let's do the last two here. Indigenous sustainability. That's a nice mouthful there. I don't know how much he was trying to fit the little thing here, but indigenous sustainability. But the idea is a powerful idea. The idea is what will help the church and ministry to grow in the place that you're trying to reach. That you don't need an outside missionary to do. How is this going to spread? There are places that the ground is hard, there are no evangelists there, and you've got to get the ground started. You need to get things going there. But the ultimate goal is disciples that make disciples. You want a movement spreading that you don't have to have a missionary to start each church. At least an American missionary to start each church. What if you could lead 10 Chinese to become disciples, and then they start sharing the gospel with other people in their community, and they plant a church, and then they grow big enough and they decide to spread and start another church. That's what's happening in China. That's what's happening in some of the places in the world where the church is growing the fastest. Is that there are churches being planted and planted and planted, but it's not American missionaries doing that. The American missionaries might have been or European missionaries might have been some of the first ones that get the gospel to that area, but now it's being spread that way. We talked about on the unreached people groups. Talked about one of the reasons why those unreached people groups are there is the majority of the unreached people groups are in places that if you put, I'm a United States citizen and I want to be a missionary in this place, they will not allow you to come in. They will not give you a visa. You cannot get into North India. You have trouble getting into India, period. You cannot get into China that way. You cannot get into communist countries. You cannot get into a lot of dictatorships. You cannot get into Islam countries. Some of the most unreached places in the world are inaccessible to the normal, I'm a American missionary, I want to come. So how do you get in?
Even friendly countries are asked, what's in it for us? And are you taking a job that someone else here can do?
Yeah, they'll allow you in if you have a technical expertise that they are lacking in their country, but they will not accept you in if you're doing a job or say that you have some ability that they don't value. And missions is often a value they don't want. You know, Japan isn't looking for Christian missionaries to enter the country. They're just not. They do not have a concern for that. Places where the gospel is more spread, you know, Brazil, they're fine with Christian missionaries coming in many times. But that's because they value Christianity because they have a Christian base in their country. I'm not saying we don't need to do stuff in Brazil, and there's certainly different places have different needs. But the ideal thing is to get something growing within those nations, within those peoples. And the biggest movements in our world spreading the gospel are places like northern India being reached by southern India, western China being reached from eastern China, places like that. Christians within these poor countries that are reaching out to their own peoples or similar peoples. And it's much cheaper and they're much more connected with the culture. All right, last one is equity. Here's the last challenge, is to help bring equity here, making sure we're not giving or creating disparities where we're giving. So if we give real nice gifts to this one church or this one minister or whatever like that, what's that going to do with them and connecting with their society or their culture and their people? Sometimes that giving those gifts or providing something we think would be fairly basic would separate them so much from their people and the people around them that they end up losing a witness there. They see them as a bought-off foreigner. And there's a lot of local pastors in other nations that have lost their witness because they've accepted American money and accepted a lifestyle that's higher than the people around them. So the missionaries have to deal with this too. You know, missionaries have to give up a lot to go overseas, but then if they live at what we would say is a low standard of living for our country, it still might be a very high, wealthy standard of living in that country. And it separates themselves from the people. So bringing that together, and the way this suggests, and I've heard elsewhere, is that usually the best place to give and to connect with is the local church that knows the culture, or a missionary that's been there a very long time, has gained respect of the culture. They understand what's going on there. They understand what works, and hand them the help that they need to be able to do their work, or maybe local godly believers there that are doing good mission work or church planting or whatever, or pastors or whatever, that are being faithful to the Lord without getting paid, and be able to help with them, but help in appropriate amounts. You're not just giving it to one person, you're giving it to a church so that the church knows how best to give that out. Say, well, okay, we're going to take care of our pastor, but we're not going to build a fancy building because that's not going to work. We're going to use it to spread it out or to meet needs that are in the community or whatever. So, but then you even have to be careful with that. But the equity part is making sure we're not creating these kind of like spikes of great wealth. Money can create those problems in other places. So anyway, I encourage you, if you want to look up, really learn a lot, I think this book is tremendous. Those other books are valuable too. But maybe just thinking more carefully and praying about the way we give. God knows exactly what's going on. God will help us, give us wisdom where we can't find out all the answers. And we can pray that God works even in the midst of corruption, and some loss in places where not everything helps the way we hoped it would. But all right, let me close in prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for this time here, Lord. Help us to grow in faithfulness, to give and give wisely. Give us wisdom, Lord, and clarity as a church and as individuals who we should support. Help us to be careful in what we do, and we pray that the money and the gifts and the work that we do would be used for your glory around the world, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. And help us also to be bold in those relationships and encouraging those missionaries and people doing the hard work, Lord. Help us to know how to support them other than just finances as well. Thank you, Lord, for the heart of this church, and help it to continue to grow and just do mighty work for you.